The top story this evening, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has expressed confidence in resolving the tariff standoff hours after President Donald Trump slammed trade ties with India as a totally one-sided disaster. Trump's statement came after Prime Minister Modi met Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russia's Putin in Tianjin over the weekend. This was the Prime Minister's first trip to China in 7 years, coming in the midst of a tariff standoff with the Trump administration. However, Bessent criticized India for its purchase of Russian oil once again and accused the country of financing the war in Ukraine. Reacting to Prime Minister Modi's visit to China for the SCO summit, Bessent told Fox News that the meeting was largely performative. He said, and I quote, "India is the most populous democracy in the world, and at the end of the day, their values are much closer to ours than to China's and than to Russia's," end of quote. White House trade advisor Peter Navarro told reporters that the show of unity by Modi, Putin and Xi did not make sense. Navarro referred to Prime Minister Modi as a leader of the biggest democracy and Putin and Xi as the two biggest authoritarian dictators in the world. Petroleum Minister Hardeep Singh Puri, meanwhile, has responded to Navarro's earlier comments, where he referred to India as an oil money laundromat for the Kremlin. In a column in The Hindu, Puri wrote, and I quote, "Some critics allege that India has become a laundromat for Russian oil. Nothing could be further from the truth," end of quote. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has said that the situation with China is getting back to normal, with border issues being resolved. He added that India is in dialogue with the United States for a bilateral trade agreement.
Already completed Mauritius, Australia's first tranche, the four-nation EFTA bloc, UK, UAE. Lots have happened, lots more to go. But all of the US, we are in dialogue with them for a bilateral trade agreement.
It was a shame to see Modi getting in bed as the leader of the biggest democracy in the world with the two biggest authoritarian dictators in the world, in Putin and Xi Jinping. That doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure what he's thinking, particularly since India has been in a Cold War and sometimes a hot war with China for decades.
Joining us right now is Velina Tchakarova, a well-known geopolitical strategist and the founder of FACE for a Conscious Experience, which is a global geopolitical strategy firm. Thank you very much for being with us, Velina. Let me begin by asking you about the India-US relations in light of what has happened at the SCO summit and what President Trump, White House officials Scott Bessent and Peter Navarro have said about India. How do you see things between the two countries right now?
Surely the bilateral relationship right now between United States and India has a lot of problems due to Trump tariffs policies. Trump tariff approach is actually not just about trade. And yes, of course, we can argue that the trade between India and US is highly asymmetrical. But at the same time, let me remind you that Trump tariff approach is not just about tariffs and trade, it's about geopolitical realignment. And India set a very straightforward red line when it comes to their own national interest. That is that India will decide, based on its own interest, whether to side with the one or the other so-called geopolitical bloc. And in reality, this is what happened at the CSCO in China, where Prime Minister Modi met with Xi Jinping in a bilateral format. He met with Russian President Putin in a bilateral format. Then he also attended the summit. At the same time, I want to stress that this is not the lowest point of the US-Indian relationship. On the opposite, there is plenty of potential, a lot of layers in this bilateral relationship, which are still quite functional. And of course, my working thesis here is that there will be a bilateral conversation between Modi and Trump. That's for sure. And obviously, after this bumpy start of the relationship following, the second Trump administration inauguration, there will be a normalization of the relation because India is a huge market. It's the fastest growing large economy in the world, and United States cannot ignore this new reality.
Right. Velina, by when do you think things will start to normalize? And what will be the nature of the relationship between India and US for the rest of the Trump administration? The reason that I ask you this, we've drawn our red lines on agriculture and dairy. We've said that we will not acknowledge US's role as far as the ceasefire with Pakistan go. And we've also offered a deal in June whereby the tariffs were much lower than 15%. It was in the range of 10 to 13%. We are pushing for that deal. Eventually, where do you think the chips are going to fall?
Well, certainly the 15% tariff base must be regarded as, I think, the base for any negotiation between United States and India. If you consider all other Indo-Pacific allies of United States, they've received, up to 15 up to 20%, 25, and in the case of European Union, most favorable conditions. So this should be the base. But then again, let's be real. Here we do not talk simply about tariff policies, because you know for a fact that administrations come and go, and even right now internally the whole tariff policy is being questioned. So what is more important is for this administration to come to terms with the approach of India, which is very different from most of the other Indo-Pacific allies and partners, as well as the transatlantic partners. Here, Washington expects the impossible, and that is that India should align either with the United States or with China in this new Cold War 2.0 context, and this is not happening. So the problem is that there is a nexus between economics and geopolitics right now, and in the case of India, this nexus cannot be achieved on behalf of the US foreign policy. So what we will actually witness, in my view, in the next 2 weeks and months is going to be a kind of a recalibration of the US foreign policy approach towards India. We will witness much, much different narrative, kind of I think there are a lot of bilaterals happening already behind the curtains. Peter Navarro will have to, in my view, scale down these kind of statements that he's giving every day, and they are really full of incorrect takes, factual errors. So in my view, this will be scaled down. And as I said, given all the other priorities, because right now, United States, Trump administration, they are eyeing, of course, all the ceasefires. They have other, more urgent topics to tackle. But in a sense, my expectation is that in the next, weeks to up to few months, there will be a significant breakthrough in the bilateral relationship.
All right. So, Velina, very briefly, before I move on to the next topics, your analysis is that this is not about trade anymore. This is not about agriculture and dairy, not even about thanking Donald Trump or nominating him for a Nobel Prize. It's a clear geopolitical alignment that the US is seeking. Either you're with us or without us. Does that...
Exactly.
Does that sound...
100%. And of course, the big issue here, what happened is Pakistan. That US has basically decided to lure Pakistan into its own orbit, something that we already observed during the first Cold War. It's nothing new. What's new, of course, is now the expectation that there would be a sort of peace between Pakistan and India, not even normalization. Remember what happened with the whole narrative coming from Washington that basically Trump and his team brought about the ceasefire, which Prime Minister Modi is still, declining as a matter of fact. And of course, the other expectation is that these two would just get along, would forget the last escalation phase that happened after the terrorist attack in April, and that they would move on. And these are, of course, really the big issues. And there is indeed also a topic of ego, of personal ego, where obviously there has been a clash between personalities. We should factor in this as well. But at the core of this is really about taking a side, and India is a different scale of a country. It's a middle power of its own scale and scope, not to be compared with Pakistan, not to be compared with any other middle powers that are having a certain strategic autonomy of action. But of course, in the Indian case, it's going to be about acting as a geopolitical bridge builder between these two new worlds, because we have the dragon bear world. We've seen what's happening in China. We witnessed what actually was being discussed between Putin and Xi Jinping. We know for a fact that there is a non-Western bloc emerging right now, where India has a voice, where India has a participation, where India has allies and partners. And at the same time, we know for a fact that India has deepened its relationship, not only with the US for the last several years, but also with all relevant American allies in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay. Now, to speak to you about what happened at the SCO, we saw that long meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. We also saw a very long, almost 2-hour-long meetings between Putin and Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well. How do you see this in the context of geopolitical recalibration and realignments?
So first important point I want to make is that this bilateral relationship between India and China, the launch of normalization of the ties, has nothing to do with Trump. It has begun before the election of Trump in 2024. In fact, it was the most positive and the most important geopolitical development in the last year. And now, of course, it went to the next, let's say, stage, which is good news. It's good news not only for the two countries, for China and for India, for their economies, for their people, for businesses. It should create more predictability, more transparency when it comes to foreign investors, when it comes to collaborations around the globe. So that's all good news actually for the countries, both for India and for China. But also, of course, we have now the Trump factor. We cannot ignore. And Trump factor is actually an accelerator of this relationship. It's not the trigger of it. So the normalization has started based on national interest calculus on both sides. It has, of course, also the factor Russia, because Russia is this geopolitical glue between China and India. Obviously, both countries have right now the best relationship with Russia, historically seen. And, third point, of course, is what we should not ignore, the interconnectedness of the global system. That means that still, if India wants to become world's economic power number 3 in this decade, it will have to settle its economic and trade relationship with China in a workable way, so that there is actually a more solid ground for economic growth. That's, of course,
right.
Doesn't mean, and this is the last point, that this is a reset. We still have a military deterrence. It's still, of course, strategic rivalry in South Asia. And military deterrence means, of course, also more predictability, more transparency in the communication between the military personnel on both sides, so that new skirmishes along the line of actual control, along the common borders, are avoided in advance.
Right, that's an important point. If India wants to rise as one of the leading manufacturers, one of the top economies in the world in the next decade, then it has to resolve its relationship with China, bring it to a stable level, definitely. Now, when it comes to ending the Russia-Ukraine war, this has been a major goal of the Trump administration. They've not been able to achieve it. It has caused some amount of frustration. What do you think will get Putin to end this war against Ukraine? It's closely linked to what's happening with the tariffs against India. There was a 55-minute long meeting that Putin had with Modi in his presidential limousine. Clearly, they didn't want anyone to be there when they had this conversation.
Yes, certainly the two leaders used the time for this intimate bilateral talk to brief each other. First and foremost, regarding the upcoming big visit. So we know for a fact that there is another big bilateral being on the agenda of the two leaders for this year. Certainly also Putin briefed Prime Minister Modi on the Alaska summit and what has been discussed there. Right now, the situation is such that and this is my assessment for the next, let's say, few months, that there is a high likelihood that we might see some sort of a breakthrough, diplomatic breakthrough for this war to at least see, witness a stage, a phase of a kind of a ceasefire or kind of a negotiation process. Now, this is definitely good news for the world, because India, China, every country actually has been affected by this ongoing war, the one way or the other. Now, the bad news, of course, is that, and I have to say it openly, that even if I'm quite positive about some sort of negotiated process, not necessarily ending in a peace deal, but think of South Korea and North Korea, which have also been engaged in a negotiated process, and yet it did not end with a peace deal. Still, the bad news here is that this war is going to continue beyond 2030, 2032. So in the end, we will have a short break, but the war will continue because the Russian goals in this war have not been achieved yet. So Putin is still quite convinced that he will win the long war, and he has the better partners and allies to win this war. So big takeaway from the CCO summit and from the bilaterals is basically that he can rely on his allies. But the second big takeaway is that we should prepare also for this ongoing war with its all negative effects on global economy and trade for the future, which of course will accelerate the bifurcation of the global affairs, the split into two worlds, Western versus non-Western world, and obviously with all the other effects regarding international organizations and institutions.
Right. Very important point. And my last question to you, Velina, would be to understand that by the end of the Trump administration, what kind of order will India find itself in? If India wants to succeed in the current challenging environment, what kind of relationships and countries does it have to focus on?
I think that right now, India is in this unique position of having enough strategic autonomy. And yes, of course, strategic autonomy has its high price. We saw it with this deterioration of the bilateral relationship with United States because of the conflict due to tariffs. But still, India, compared to all other so-called middle powers right now, and we have plenty of them on all continents, navigating carefully between America on the one side and, as I already said several times, Dragon Bear as strategic coordination between China and Russia on the other. So navigating carefully between this Western and non-Western world, I think India has the best cards. It's not going to be a non-alignment movement this time because we have still highly interconnected global system, but it's going to be a very important bridge building position and role to play between the Western and the non-Western world. In that sense, I see India being active on both arenas, engaging more actively with the transatlantic partners and with the Indo-Pacific partners of America. And again, I argue that we will see a much better and improved relationship between United States and India, but it will take its time. And at the same time, this carefully calibrated reset with China, the deepening of the strategic partnership with Russia, and then, of course, the broad arena of Global South partners in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. This is a terrain for India's geopolitical and geoeconomic portfolio when it comes to the whole development agenda.
All right. Thank you so much, Velina, for joining us on this program. Time for a short break, but don't go anywhere. We bring you much more on the global stories on the other side.